I put this together to show how an air conditioning system works, or the refrigeration system, the basic cycle. And this is not intended for people not interested in how things work. If you're curious and you want to know what makes that wonderful cold air come out of your outlets, either in your car or in your home, I think I can explain it without getting too technical. I don't have any formulas or anything like that, and I'll try and go over it. And I'd rather do this in person because I could answer some questions. But anyway, the basic refrigeration cycle it's all centered around heat transfer. The big picture is, if you have a hot room, hot car, you want something to go in there and gather heat up, take it outside and dump it. Gather more heat up, do the same thing, and cycle like that, and you remove the heat. The way you would remove heat from air is to blow the air over something cold, and that something cold draws in the heat because it gets warm, and you take that outside and cool it off, and then you take something cold again and put in there. It absorbs heat from the air. You blow the air across that thing and you get cool air, and you dump that heat outside. Your refrigerator does the same thing. It takes the air inside the refrigerator, blows it across some cold coils, and it dumps the heat out of the back of the refrigerator. And if you raise your hand back there, you'll feel the heat that has been rejected. And if you would put a refrigerator in a room and open the door and sit in front of it and think you're going to get cool, you really wouldn't, because it's taking the heat out of the air of the refrigerator, and that does cool it. And if you stick your hand in there, it would be a little cool, but it takes that heat and dumps it out the back of the refrigerator, so the whole room gets hotter. And in total, even if you close the refrigerator, the room is going to get hotter because you've got power coming in to operate the motor. And when that power comes in, it's got to go somewhere, so it converts to heat and it heats your room. In a nuclear power plant, the atomic reaction generates heat. That's where we get the power from. But the rods that are where the reaction's taking place, they get way too hot, so they have to be cooled. So most power plants have a lake or a pond outside, and that's their water source, and they run that in through a thing called a heat exchanger, and that cooler water runs around the tubes that are hot, absorbs that heat, and then runs it back into the pond. And in that process, vapors are created, and that's the big plume of water vapor you see coming from the stacks of the atomic power plant. Here's a thing I do to demonstrate a rubber band, typical rubber band, nice big one though. If you stretch it, those molecules in there are not happy. They don't want to be stretched. They're hanging on tight. And because of that, they give off heat. They get hot and give off heat. So when you stretch a rubber band and touch it to your upper lip, you can feel it get warm. So if you take it and check it now, it's just room temperature. If you stretch it hard and put it on your lip, you can feel the warmth. If you take that rubber band and stretch it, it's hot, and now you cool it in the air in the room, and you cool it and get it down to room temperature. When you relax that rubber band, it will absorb heat because it gave off heat when it got stretched. When you relax it, it will absorb heat, and when it absorbs heat, it gets cold. And you can do that, relax it and touch it real quick, and you can feel that it's cool. And that's a trick you can do next time you run across a rubber band. But theoretically, you could take 1,000,000 rubber bands, take them outside, stretch them, cool them, bring them inside, relax them, blow air across it, and keep doing that cycle, and you would theoretically cool the room. Another form of refrigerant. And years ago they developed a material, a refrigerant, and there's many kinds of them. And due to global warming, there's new ones that are being used now. But a refrigerant is kind of a magical thing. If you put it in a tank, it's got liquid and it's got gas on top, much like water would sit in a tank with water vapor on top and liquid. And this material, the refrigerant, if you take the gas and heat it up, it gets hot, way above our outside temperature, and you run that hot refrigerant gas, compressed, out into the outside and cool it off, and then it turns into a liquid because you've taken heat out of it, and then you take that high pressure warm liquid into your house, and you expand it down to a lower pressure. As soon as it goes to a lower pressure, it gets ice cold. Now you take that ice cold refrigerant, run it through a heat exchanger, run your warm air across it, it cools your air, and then you pump that refrigerant back outside the house, pump it up to the high pressure, and then cool it. And that is the very basic refrigeration cycle. I must describe a heat exchanger. That's key to a lot of things that go on in the world. Your house has got a major heat exchanger in your heating system. You have a firebox. Your gas comes in or electricity comes in, you heat this firebox, which is a heat exchanger. It's very hot, and then you blow your air across it in the house, and your air gets warmer, and you keep feeding energy into that firebox, and you are exchanging the heat from the firebox to the air as it runs across the surface. Now, in the case of radiators and evaporators and your typical heat exchanger, the most basic would be a tube. A tube when you run, say, hot water through it. And the tube gets hot. Tube's usually made of copper, good heat transfer. And the tube gets hot. And now you blow air across that tube and the air gets warm. So you have exchanged heat. Now if you take that same tube and loop it around so that it's a long circuit, and you put some fins on it to help dissipate the heat, and you run that hot water through it, and it's hot, and when the air goes across, it feels those warm fins and it gets warm. In the case of your radiator in your car, you have hot water coming from the engine into the top of the radiator. As the water runs down through tubes and fins, the air from in front of the car comes in, cools that water, and that cooler water goes back into the engine to cool it. So a heat exchanger is key to everything. That's what transfers the heat. I'll explain that in a minute. Now let me describe a heat exchanger. Like I said before, just a tube with hot water running through it and air blowing across it is a basic heat exchanger. That will change the temperature of the air as it hits that hot tube. To make it more effective, you add fins to it. Then the heat goes from the water to the tube to the fin, and then the fin's got a lot of surface area, so the air picks up a lot of heat from that. So it's a fin and tube heat exchanger. Now if you take that tube and you make it very long and you put a series of fins through it, you've got a much more effective heat exchanger. So that's how the heat exchanger evolved. And here's a typical, you could call this an evaporator or what. You have this in your car. It's out in your backyard rejecting heat, and they take different shapes, but basically there's a tube that returns and returns and returns, and it does this many, many times. And then you have fins all along here as close as a 1/16 of an inch to each other. And then you run the air through this, and if this is cold refrigerant in here, then your warm air gets cooled. So that's the basic heat exchanger. And outside you have one with a big fan that's going to blow your outside air temperature over the fins. And in a lot of cases the fan is blowing upward, and this heat exchanger is made in a circular shape, and it's drawing air from outside and drawing the heat out of that high pressure refrigerant gas and rejecting it outside. So you're heating up the outside world when your air conditioner's running, and if the whole neighborhood's doing that, you're rejecting a lot of heat. Whatever heat they're gathering from the house is going out there. Now they do use, I've never seen one, but instead of a heat exchanger here, they put it underground, and it goes down there and sees some cold water. That's a geothermic cooling. And you run those hot gases down there, and they get cooled, and they reject the heat to the groundwater, and comes up and then goes into your evaporator in the house. That's very efficient, very costly also. Here I show a pH chart. This is the classic description of the refrigeration cycle. Pressure along this axis, heat along this axis. This is in the term used as enthalpy, but that's just heat content. As you go across here, the heat content goes up. As you go up, the pressure goes up. This is what we call the low side of the air conditioning system. It's a lower pressure, and this is the higher pressure. And your compressor takes gas. Oh, and this is all gas out here. This is wet gas. This is like water and steam sitting together right at 212 degrees. So right in here you have liquid and gas combined. Over here, by the time it gets outside of this line, it's all gas. So all this is gas, and then all this in here is liquid. So the compressor pumps the refrigerant up to the high pressure. It's very hot at this point and high pressure. Then you run that through the heat exchanger that is outside your house. And as you run it through that heat exchanger that I described, it gives up heat. It's rejecting heat. Heat is going out into your atmosphere. And then when it gets over here almost all liquid, we expand it down through either an expansion valve or capillary tubes, but it's a restriction that lets it spill down to the lower pressure. And when it gets to the lower pressure, it is ice cold. And then we run that through a heat exchanger inside the car, and it absorbs heat, and when it's absorbing heat, it's taking heat from the air that you're passing over it. So you're absorbing heat here, then it gains a lot of heat and it all turns to gas. It gets to the compressor again, it goes up, and that's the continuous cycle. When your compressor is running outside, it's pumping up, you're rejecting the heat. When you feel the top of that condensing unit, that's what the outside unit's called, a condensing unit, because it's taking gas and condensing it down to a liquid. And the evaporator inside is called an evaporator because it's taken the liquid and evaporating it into a gas. But it's a low side and a high side. And that's the basic classic description of a refrigeration system. Now, if we picture this might be a unit in a car. When I was at Chrysler, we did one just like this. It's a box, a plenum chamber for air. Your heat exchanger is put in here, and you have a covering outside. But basically, you have a blower that blows air in behind the core, the heat exchanger. The heat exchanger is ice cold because it's down here at this lower temperature and lower pressure, and it's cold, and this hot air coming in goes through, and it cools you. Now, if you put that in a car, it would look something like this. Here's the hood, the windshield, your column and the steering wheel, and your instrument panel is here. And tucked in under the instrument panel, we put this box, or a box of many, many shapes, and the warm air gets into the box, and it's cooled, and it goes out through hoses to your outlets on your instrument panel. And that's basically where that cold air comes from. I hope I haven't confused you. It's an interesting subject, and one that feels pretty good in the warm weather.